Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. In its biggest intervention in decades in the Middle East, Russia has launched a series of missile and airstrikes in various parts of Syria, claiming that it was targeting Islamic State militants. But this has been disputed by the Pentagon, which says Russia's latest military initiative is to prop up and strengthen the beleaguered regime of Syria's dictator Bashar al-Assad. And to look at the evolving situation, which is rather dynamic in the Middle East, we have two experts who have been looking at the region for years in great detail. Mr. Talmiz Ahmed, who has been formerly India's envoy to several countries in the Arab world, and we have Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, who is the professor and dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs and an extensively read columnist in Indian papers. Dr. Chaulia, one of the criticisms of President Obama has been that after he failed to get on with his red line in Syria as far as use of chemical weapons is concerned, the American reluctance to put boots on the ground, formally, as Mr. Ahmed's brought out, that there are various technical advisors and others on the ground doing all sorts of things. Apparently, a $500 million budget has been, $1 million budget has been sanctioned by the US government and the Congress to get on with this exercise of training and arming a resistance against the Islamic State and all sorts of other groups that are operating there. So do you feel that this is going to now usher in a sort of second Cold War where the dynamics of the Middle East are not going to be just dictated by Washington, but clearly Moscow wants to play a much, much bigger role than it has ever played, at least in recent memory in the region?
I think the Americans wanted to retain a monopoly, but they've been in many ways refuted by Putin's proactive military diplomacy. What has happened is that until now, while Iran and Hezbollah were supporting the Assad regime, there wasn't really a major power which was operating in the skies other than the Western ones. So now I think the dynamic has changed. The fact that the Russians are there both on ground and in air, and President Putin has spoken of bringing in volunteers as well to fight alongside the Iranian trained guerrillas as well as the Assad's army. What we're talking about is certainly a kind of an opposition of interests, wherein the West wants Assad out at all costs. At least they want some kind of political transition, while on the other hand, Putin believes that he says he's not attached to Assad per se, but he doesn't want the state to collapse, one. And certainly, he wants to change the game by making it more balanced and making it less of a pro-Western dictated terms. For example, the no-fly zone that the West and Turkey are supposed to have come close to agreeing, all these are now in jeopardy because the Russians have intervened, which means that Assad now has a leg up once again and has a chance of sitting at the table whenever there's a political settlement with more of an equal footing.
Well, interesting. Dr. Chaulia, briefly, this is a military intervention which Washington is obviously very nervous about because their entire exercise in the last year and a half, by their own official accounts and that of a serving general who was involved with it, has failed miserably. So do you think Putin has taken a risk too many by first upsetting the West in Ukraine, now taking on the West here? Or this is the rise and revival of Russia's military muscle flexing era?
I think Putin is taking a risk insofar as the sustainability of a military campaign of this scale, given the economic problems at home. But I don't think he worries too much about upsetting the West, because that has been in many ways what has actually given him strength with domestic public opinion. He's extremely popular, and internationally there are a number of players. It's not just Iran and Iraq which are supporting what Russia is doing. Silently, most members of the international community, barring the pro-Western ones, would applaud, because for them it's necessary to see a sense of a balance. So while Russia cannot match the United States or China in economic might anymore, it still has considerable military firepower and it is its strength. So I think Putin is playing to his strength by deploying it and trying to change the political dimension on the ground.
It's said that Syria has seen the use of chemical weapons on several occasions in the last 4 years. And obviously the regime has stalled the efforts of agencies to try and get to the depth of the matter. But clearly, this conflict has brought out the worst in all conflicts that we've seen in recent years: chemical weapons, a refugee crisis, humanitarian disaster, which is of proportions I think even the UN can't handle. So, and some experts now say that the conflict has the fuel to last a few more years. So are we looking at all this magnifying twice over?
I hope not. I think what will happen if the Russians continue down this path is not the doomsday that the Americans are predicting, but rather some kind of a concerted effort, because now there are two coalitions, both purportedly saying that they want to counter jihadists and extremists. But the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Americans and the Turkey are on one side, and Iran, Iraq and Russia are on the other side. But if we can have a grand coalition, which President Putin has been mooting, but unfortunately has been rebuffed so far by the West, I think it's possible actually to have a concerted effort, and that will eventually put pressure on the jihadists. And frankly, even Russia has said they are not personally attached to Assad himself. So as long as the state survives and there is a transition without jihadist pockets of large pockets of jihadist influence, I think we can see a settlement. So I'm more hopeful that over the next 6 months we're going to see that the jihadists are on the run if Russia sustains this, and the Americans are now under pressure also to prove their mettle as counter-terrorism force, because now they are saying we are going to train 5,000 more Arab fighters and deploy them in Syria over the coming months on a fast-forward basis.
Mr. Chaulia, Dr. Chaulia, sir, last quick point. Lots of countries in the region who were traditionally seen as America's friends, Iran, Israel for one, has now gone ahead in some kind of tacit approval of the Russian intervention. Israel's Prime Minister made a visit to Moscow, so have others. In fact, even John Kerry is on record to say that we are not looking at a regime change tomorrow or 1 month or later. What we are looking at, some kind of stability in the region before we can take the next set of steps. What's your take?
It is possible. I mean, it's always tantalizing in complex armed conflicts like that, that they may eventually reach a modus vivendi when they're all tired and they know that nobody can really win on the battlefield. But nonetheless, it is a matter of concern from the Russian and the Iranian point of view that the West tends to take a line that it's either my way or the highway, as in they want to dictate the terms of the settlement. And what Putin is essentially doing now is shaking up that prospect and saying, you cannot dictate it, it's got to be a compromise.
Thank you very much for being with us on this show, sir.